Okay, ready to dive into some distance learning.
Always. Though
Let's go.
Eddie's a funny little phrase when you think about it.
Right, like isn't learning about getting closer to something,
hmm
connecting, but here we are sticking distance right in there.
And yet it's huge EE. And the story of how we got here. Fascinating.
That's what we're diving into today. We've got some great research lined up that really digs into the history, how we define it, even some of the big theories about how distance learning actually works.
Yeah, it's not just about slapping courses online.
Yeah.
There's a lot more going on under the surface.
Exactly. And to get us started, get this. The earliest recorded distance learning course in the U.S., 1728.
Wow, okay, you're going way back. What, like colonial times?
Yep. A shorthand course taught entirely through the mail.
Shorthand by mail. Talk about commitment.
Right. That's dedication. And it really kicks off this whole era of correspondence courses. Became huge in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Handwritten assignments. Snail mail. Makes you appreciate how easy we've got it now.
Tell me about it. But it wasn't just the Postal Service, right? Think radio in the 1920s, educational TV programs, things like that really changed the game.
Oh yeah, University of the Air, that kind of thing.
Right.
Bringing education right into people's homes.
Exactly. And that eventually evolved into two-way communication systems, which really paved the way for the online learning environments we have today.
It's wild, though, even with all that, the jump to fully online courses wasn't exactly a straight line.
You're saying it wasn't as simple as, boom, internet, online courses everywhere.
Nope. You had platforms like Campus popping up as early as 1986,
Yeah.
before the World Wide Web was even a thing for most people. Seriously. This was people experimenting with online learning on platforms like AOL. Talk about ahead of their time.
That blows my mind.
But it shows you that desire to bridge the distance, to connect learners and educators, it's been driving innovation for a long time.
It's like the technology was almost secondary to that drive.
In a way, yeah.
So we've got these pioneers figuring out online learning on those clunky early platforms, and it totally set the stage.
And look at how fast it took off. Think about the University of Phoenix. They were one of the first to really go all in on online degrees back in the late 80s.
And by 2017, they were the largest university in the U.S. based on enrollment.
Exactly. That tells you something, right?
It says online learning is a big deal. But you're right. It really makes you wonder what even IS distance in education at this point.
It's a great question. Is it just about physical space? Or is it something more nuanced? Like, have we created a whole new kind of distance with these different approaches to teaching and learning?
Almost like we've traded miles for methods.
Right. Bring everyone closer physically, but then you've got all these other differences popping up.
Different levels of interaction, different ways of teaching. Suddenly, distance isn't just about geography anymore.
And that's where it gets tricky, because if we can't even agree on what distance learning is, how can we possibly expect to fund it right, regulate it fairly, even just figure out if it's working?
It's like the Wild West of education in some ways.
Exactly.
I mean, in the early days, it seemed simpler. Most definitions focused on that physical separation, like Keegan's definition, that was a big one back in 1980.
Yeah, he really zeroed in on technology bridging that physical gap. Made sense at the time.
But then the internet happens, and suddenly there are all these different ways to do online learning. And the old definitions, they just don't cut it anymore.
It's not just about delivering information anymore, is it? It's the difference between watching a recording of a lecture versus like being in a live online seminar with people all over the world.
Totally. Technically, both are distance learning, but they're totally different experiences.
Night and day. And I think that's why you started seeing researchers like Simonson and Seepersod trying to add more to the definition.
They were really emphasizing things like two-way communication, individualized instruction, that kind of thing.
They knew those old definitions were too simple for this new world of online learning. It wasn't just, are the teacher and student in the same room anymore?
But even with those additions, finding one definition everyone agrees on, still tough.
Moving target for sure. And it matters. It's not just a theoretical debate.
Right. This whole definition dilemma has real consequences.
Big time.
Like that whole thing with Western Governors University, WGU.
Oh, yeah. The WGU case is a perfect example of why this matters. So you've got this university, huge online enrollment, all about competency-based learning, really innovative stuff.
And then they got in trouble with the U.S. Department of Education. I vaguely remember this.
Yeah, big audit back in 2017, and suddenly they're being accused of basically running a glorified correspondence course.
Seriously, what was the problem? Did they just forget to file some paperwork or something?
It was more about how they were defining or not defining distance education. See, the Department of Education was about ready to pull their Title IV funding, make them pay back a ton of money.
Whoa, all over a definition.
All because the auditors didn't think WGU's version of online learning had enough regular and substantive interaction between teachers and students. They were basically debating whether it even counted as real education.
That's wild. So much writing on those definitions. It really makes you think those early pioneers like Socrates, no classrooms, no structured curriculum, just conversations out in the world.
Right. Makes you wonder what those auditors would have thought.
But seriously, the WGU case is a good reminder. It's not just about words on paper. It's about funding, public perception.
It's about what it means to be a legitimate educational institution, and that's changing fast. So how do we guarantee quality and access for students when learning can happen anywhere, anytime?
And what does quality even mean in this new world, right?
Exactly. It's a huge question, and thankfully there have been some really smart people trying to make sense of it all.
People who understand it's not just about technology anymore. We're talking about fundamentally different ideas about how learning happens. It really is fascinating when you look at those different philosophies of education. Like in the research we're looking at, Johnston talks about all these different theorists who've really wrestled with those fundamental questions about what distance education is.
Oh yeah, it's a real brain teaser, and there are some fascinating takes on it.
Yeah. Right. And they're not just stuck in the past either. Like, take someone like Wedemeyer. He was all about independent study, believed distance could actually be an advantage.
Yeah, he was way ahead of his time.
Yeah.
And he had a point, right? Give learners more control, let them set their own pace, really dive into what interests them.
Exactly. That freedom to explore, go on those tangents. Sometimes that's how we learn best.
Absolutely. But then you've got someone like Peters, who came at it from a whole different angle. He offered these two models of distance education, the network-based model, and then what he called the technologically extended classroom.
And those represent two very different schools of thought, right? Like with the network-based model, you're really leaning into the decentralized nature of online learning.
Right. It's all about those online communities, open educational resources, almost like creating your own curriculum, finding your own path.
Exactly. Very different from that extended classroom idea, which is more about keeping the structure of the traditional classroom, just using technology to deliver it.
And even within that, you've got Inglis coming in with his distinctions between resource-based learning, which is more about self-instruction, versus network learning, which is all about the human connection.
Again, that tension between using technology for access to information versus using it for human interaction.
It's that balance that we're always trying to find. And it's not easy because there's no one right answer. It reminds me of more in his idea of transactional distance. This isn't about physical distance, but that perceived gap between the student and the teacher.
And the really interesting thing there is that Moore believed you could actually shrink that gap, even in a distance learning environment. The key is that interaction, that engagement.
It's about creating those moments of connection, no matter where the learning is taking place. Which I think brings us back to Johnston's proposal about rethinking how we even define distance learning in the first place. Because clearly, a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work anymore.
Definitely not. Especially with all the different models out there, we need more nuanced definitions, which is exactly what Johnston is trying to do, right? He proposes two main categories: virtual network education and then direct content education.
And those categories really get at the heart of what makes each approach unique, right? Like virtual network education, that's all about that self-directed autonomous learning happening outside those traditional institutions a lot of the time.
It's about taking advantage of those networks, right? Connecting with other learners, finding resources, kind of forging your own path. Then on the other hand, you've got direct content education, which is more what we see with online degree programs, that kind of thing. Maybe not as much autonomy, but still a lot more flexibility compared to traditional classrooms.
It's finding that middle ground. Structure, but with flexibility. And honestly, that model is probably here to stay, especially as more and more institutions are trying to adapt, meet their students' needs, right?
And it's not about saying one is better than the other. It's about recognizing they both have value, and what matters is finding the approach that works best for each individual learner.
100%. And the really exciting, maybe even a little daunting thing is that this is just the beginning. As technology keeps evolving, we're going to see even more innovative approaches to distance learning. The question is, how do we make sure those approaches are actually enhancing the learning experience, not just replicating what we've always done? And what will that even look like 5, 10 years down the road?
It's like we're constantly redefining what distance even means.
Right. And as we wrap up, that's something for everyone to think about, whether you're an educator, a student, or just someone who's fascinated by the future of learning, like us. How is technology changing what it means to learn, to teach, to connect across those distances, big or small? Because it's happening right now.
And who knows what incredible new possibilities are just on the horizon.